I was 19 when I landed a summer job as an overnight security guard at the shopping mall in my hometown. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid better than fast food, and the manager promised it would be easy work. All I had to do was sit in the control room, monitor cameras, and occasionally walk the halls to make sure no one had broken in. The job sounded almost too easy. On my first night, I showed up at 10 p.m. when the last stores were closing. The mall emptied out pretty quickly. A few late-night workers dragged garbage bags out to the dumpsters, and then it was just me and one other guard named Dennis, an older guy in his late 50s. He was only there until midnight, and then the place was mine until 6 a.m. Before he left, Dennis gave me the usual rundown, keys, codes, and where the cameras were located. But as he was heading out, he paused at the door and said something that I laughed off at the time. "Don't let the cameras mess with your head. You'll see things. Everyone does." I assumed he meant shadows, reflections, maybe just boredom. But later, I'd understand exactly what he meant. The first 2 hours went smoothly. I sat in the control room with the bank of monitors, flipping between camera angles. Empty food court. Empty clothing stores. Hallways so quiet that they almost looked frozen in time. I walked the mall once around midnight, just to stretch my legs. The air conditioning was still running, but without people, the place felt cold and hollow. It was around 1 a.m. when I noticed something strange. On the monitor showing the second floor, outside of a shoe store, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But when I leaned closer, I clearly saw a shadow, human-shaped, tall, and thin, walk across the hallway. My heart skipped. Nobody was supposed to be inside. I immediately cycled through the cameras, looking for whoever it was. But when I switched back to the hallway, it was empty. Completely empty. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, forcing myself to check it out. I walked to the exact hallway I had just seen on camera. My footsteps echoed through the tiled corridor. I swept the flashlight across the storefronts, glass reflecting the beam back at me. Everything was still, just mannequins staring blankly from behind glass. There was no one there. I went back to the control room, a little shaken but trying to be rational. Maybe it had been glare. Maybe a bug crawling on the lens. That's what I told myself. For the next hour, nothing happened. I got comfortable again, even pulled out my phone. But right around 2:30 a.m., I saw it again. On camera 14, which faced a long stretch of the food court, the same tall, shadowy figure walked past the tables. This time, it didn't look like a normal person. It looked wrong, like it was stretched taller than it should be, its arms dangling too long at its sides. I froze, staring at the monitor. And then it stopped walking. It turned. Not toward the food court, not down a hallway, but toward the camera itself. For several seconds, the figure just stood there, facing the lens. My stomach dropped as I realized its head was tilted slightly to the side, as if it were aware I was watching it. I blinked. The next second, the figure was gone. I didn't want to check it out this time. Every instinct told me not to. But protocol said I had to. So I forced myself to walk the length of the food court. Empty. Silent. I was about to turn back when I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't mine. They were faint, echoing from behind me, like someone walking just a few paces back. My chest tightened. Slowly, I turned around, sweeping the flashlight. No one was there. The food court tables were perfectly still. The tiled floor gleamed. But the sound had been unmistakable. I hurried back to the control room, locking the door behind me. By 3:15 a.m., I was sitting stiff in my chair, staring at the monitors without blinking. My mind was racing, and I was counting the hours until sunrise. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. On camera 3, the one showing the hallway right outside the control room door, there was movement. At first, it was just a flicker of static. But then the shape appeared. The tall, shadowy figure was standing directly outside the control room door. I jumped out of my chair, backing up against the opposite wall. The camera showed the thing standing there motionless, just inches from the door. I held my breath, waiting to hear the knob turn or the sound of a knock. But nothing came. I stared at the monitor for what felt like forever, paralyzed. Then the screen flickered again, and the figure was gone. I rushed to the door, yanked it open, and shined my flashlight into the hall. Empty. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I refused to leave the control room again. Every noise, every flicker of static on the monitors had me on edge. By the time Dennis showed up at 6 a.m. to relieve me, I looked like I hadn't slept in days. He took one look at my face and gave a small, knowing nod. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said. I didn't even bother asking what it was. He already knew. I quit after that first week. The manager was disappointed, but I couldn't bring myself to go back. Not after what I'd seen. Even now, years later, I remember the way that shadow looked on the monitor. Too tall. Too thin. And the way it seemed to turn its head, acknowledging me. Sometimes I wonder if I only saw it on the cameras, or if it really was behind me, following me through those empty halls. Because on my last night, when I walked to my car in the still dark parking lot, I heard footsteps again. And this time, they didn't stop when I turned around. I've been a nurse for almost 10 years, and I can tell you this much: hospitals are a completely different world at night. When visiting hours end, when the lights dim in the hallways, and when most patients are asleep, the silence becomes heavy. The building feels too large, too empty, and every sound seems amplified. I had worked plenty of night shifts before, but one in particular still gives me chills. It was a Tuesday night, around 1 a.m. The emergency room had slowed down, and I was making my usual rounds in the East Wing. This wing of the hospital wasn't very busy anymore. Most of its rooms were closed off for renovations. That meant it was usually quiet, sometimes eerily so. As I was finishing up some paperwork at the nurse's station, the phone on the counter buzzed. It was the front desk. "Can you check on the patient in room 306? The receptionist asked. "Family called earlier, said she might need help." I nodded, wrote it down, and grabbed a fresh chart. Room 306 was at the very end of the East Wing. I didn't think twice about it at first. When I got there, the hallway was darker than usual. A few of the lights had burned out, and the hum of the air conditioner echoed through the empty space. I pushed open the door to room 306, expecting it to be empty or under maintenance. But there she was. An elderly woman sat upright in bed, her thin hands folded neatly in her lap. Her hair was white and wispy, her skin pale but smooth. She wore a faded hospital gown, and her eyes immediately met mine as I entered. "Oh, thank goodness," she said softly. "It gets so lonely at night." Her voice was gentle, almost soothing. I glanced around the room, no IVs, no machines, just a standard bed and nightstand. Something about it struck me as unusual, but I forced a smile. "I'm here to check on you," I said. "Are you feeling okay? Any pain?" She shook her head. "No pain. Just tired. They keep moving me around, you know. Different rooms. I can't keep track anymore." I scribbled some notes in the chart, though I wasn't even sure what to write. There was no record of her being here that I could recall. After a few minutes of small talk, she thanked me for coming and said she wanted to try to sleep again. I wished her good night and stepped out, making a note to update her file. Back at the station, I pulled up the patient records on the computer. I typed in room 306. Nothing. I typed in elderly female. Still nothing. Confused, I called the front desk again. "Hey, can you give me the patient's name in 306? The records are pulling up." There was a pause. "Room 306, the receptionist repeated. That wing is closed. Nobody's in there." I froze. "What do you mean?" "I just spoke with her." Another pause. Then, "Ma'am, that room has been sealed off for renovations for over a year." I hung up without saying another word. My stomach twisted. I immediately went back down the hall, heart pounding, and pushed open the door to room 306 again. The room was empty. Not just empty, bare. The bed was stripped, the nightstand gone, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust. The smell of old plaster and cleaning chemicals filled the air. It looked like no one had been in there for months. But I had just spoken to her. I tried to convince myself I was overtired, maybe imagining things. Nurses on long shifts sometimes doze off and have vivid daydreams, it happens. But this didn't feel like that. It felt real. Too real. The next night, I worked another late shift. I couldn't stop thinking about that woman. Around 2 a.m., as I was walking past the east wing again, I stopped in front of room 306. The door was shut, just as it had been the night before. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside, the bed was back. Sheets neatly tucked. Nightstand in the corner. And lying there, under the dim light, was the same woman. This time, she didn't speak. She just stared at me. Her pale eyes followed me as I slowly backed out of the room. When I closed the door, my hands were shaking so badly I could hardly hold the handle. The following morning, I finally told one of my coworkers about what I had seen. She gave me a long, uncomfortable look before saying, "You know room 306, right? An older woman died in there a few years ago. Heart failure. She used to complain about being moved around too much, and she hated being alone at night." My blood ran cold. She had repeated those exact words to me. Since that night, I avoid the East Wing whenever I can. Even if I have to pass through it, I keep my eyes down and walk fast. Some nights, though, I swear I see movement from the corner of my eye when I pass by room 306. Sometimes, I hear her soft voice too. "Thank goodness you're here." I've worked in hospitals long enough to know that death lingers. Some people pass quietly, others fight until the very end. And some never leave at all. But I'll never forget the way that woman looked at me. Not angry, not sad, just lonely. As if she was waiting for someone to sit with her just a little longer. I don't think she meant me any harm. But the fact that she still waits, night after night, in a sealed-off room where no living patient should be. That's something I'll never be able to explain. When I was 17, I took a part-time job at a gas station just outside my town. It was one of those places you only stop at if you're running low on fuel during a long drive, quiet, isolated, and surrounded by nothing but fields. The owner paid me a little extra for night shifts, and since I needed the money, I usually worked from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Most nights were boring. A handful of truckers would pull in, maybe someone grabbing coffee or cigarettes, but for hours at a time, the place was dead silent. I'd sit behind the counter, scrolling my phone or staring at the security monitors just to stay awake. But one night in October, I learned why no one really liked working the late shift there. It was around midnight when I first saw him. A tall man in a long, dark coat came in and walked straight to the back of the store. He didn't say hello, didn't even glance at me. He just grabbed a soda, placed it on the counter, and stared at me while I rang it up. His eyes were strange, wide, unblinking, and fixed on me the entire time. When I handed him his change, his cold fingers brushed mine. Without a word, he turned and walked out. Weird, but not terrifying. People are odd all the time in gas stations. At 1:30 a.m., he came back. This time, he bought a pack of gum. Same behavior. Silent. Staring. Leaving without a word. By 3 a.m., he had returned 3 more times, each time buying something small, chips, a lighter, a candy bar. It was unsettling, but I told myself maybe he was just a restless trucker or someone killing time on a long drive. Then, around 3:15, I looked up at the front doors and froze. He was standing outside. Not coming in, not pumping gas, just standing there in the glow of the fluorescent lights, his coat swaying slightly in the breeze. He wasn't moving, wasn't smoking, wasn't on his phone. He was just watching me. I tried not to panic. I busied myself stocking shelves, pretending I didn't notice. When I finally worked up the courage to glance outside again, he was gone. Relieved, I went back behind the counter and checked the security monitors. My blood ran cold. On the back camera, the one that showed the employee-only entrance, he was standing there. Right at the door. Still motionless. Still staring. The only thing separating me from him was a thin metal lock. I grabbed the phone and called the police. My voice was shaking as I explained that a man had been circling the store all night and was now standing at the back door. The dispatcher told me an officer was on the way. I watched the monitor, waiting for him to move, but he didn't. He just stood there, face tilted slightly upward, staring into the camera as if he knew I was watching him. After what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, the patrol car finally pulled into the lot. The officer checked around, flashlight sweeping the corners of the building. I hurried outside to meet him, pointing to the back door where I had seen the man. There was nothing there. The officer looked skeptical. "Are you sure you weren't just tired?" "It's late." I insisted. I even showed him the security feed. But when I rewound the footage, the man wasn't there. The camera showed nothing but an empty doorway. I didn't know what to say. I knew I had seen him. I knew he had been standing there. But without proof, the officer just shrugged and told me to call again if anything happened. For the rest of my shift, I was on edge. I kept glancing at the doors, the monitors, the dark windows. Nothing. No sign of him. When the sun finally rose, I was exhausted but relieved. I told my boss about it later that day, and he gave me a strange look. "You saw him too?" he asked quietly. That's when he explained. Over the years, multiple night shift workers had reported seeing a man matching the same description, tall, thin, wearing a dark coat. Sometimes he bought things, sometimes he just stood outside watching. And sometimes, he appeared on the cameras in places no one could reach. When police were called, he always vanished. No footprints, no trace. Most workers quit after a sighting. I probably should have. But I needed the paycheck. A couple weeks later, I was on another night shift, trying not to think about him. Everything was quiet until around 2 a.m. I was watching the monitors when something caught my eye. In the grainy footage of camera 6, the one pointing at the gas pumps, I saw him. The same man. Same coat. Same wide, unblinking stare. But this time, he wasn't outside the store. He was inside. Standing between the aisles, right in front of the candy shelf. I shot up from my chair, heart pounding. My eyes darted to the front of the store, nothing. The aisles were empty. But on the monitor, he was there, unmoving. I blinked, looked again, and the camera feed flickered. Suddenly, the aisle was empty. That was my breaking point. I quit the job the next morning. To this day, I don't know what he was, or if anyone ever truly figured it out. But I've since read online that other small-town gas stations have had their own stories of silent men who linger, watching, waiting. All I know is this. Working alone at night, you learn to appreciate the quiet. But sometimes, the quiet hides something. Something that just stands there. Watching. And waiting for you to notice. A couple years ago, I worked the night shift at a massive distribution warehouse just outside the city. The place was huge, rows and rows of towering shelves stacked with boxes, forklifts parked in corners, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Most nights, it was just me and one other worker. Sometimes, it was just me. My job was simple: do inventory, make sure shipments were logged, and keep an eye out for anything unusual. It wasn't exactly thrilling work, but it paid well enough. The only thing I didn't like was how big the building felt when you were alone. When the machines were off and the radios were silent, You could hear every tiny sound, the creak of a shelf, the distant hum of the lights, even your own breathing echoing back at you. But on one night in particular, the sounds weren't just mine. It started around 1 a.m. I was scanning boxes in one of the aisles when I heard a loud clang. It sounded like something heavy had fallen from a shelf about 2 rows over. I froze. The first thing I thought was that someone else had come in. Maybe another worker, maybe even a thief. I called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" No response. I walked down the row, turned the corner, and shined my flashlight between the shelves. A couple boxes had tipped over and spilled across the floor. Nothing else. I told myself maybe they'd been stacked poorly. I res-tacked them and went back to work. But not even 20 minutes later, I heard footsteps. Distinct. Heavy. They echoed down the aisle behind me, slow and deliberate, like someone was following at a distance. I spun around, flashlight cutting through the shadows. Empty. The footsteps stopped as soon as I turned. I tried to brush it off, but my nerves were on edge. The warehouse was massive, and with the stacks towering above you, it was easy to feel like you weren't really alone. As I moved to the next section, I noticed something odd on the ground. An ID badge. I picked it up, expecting to recognize the name of one of my coworkers. But the name didn't ring a bell. The photo showed a man in his late 30s with a shaved head and tired eyes. The plastic was cracked, as if it had been stepped on multiple times. I carried it back to the supervisor's office and left it on the desk to ask about in the morning. But the entire time I walked back through the aisles, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Around 3 a.m., I went to the break room for coffee. As I was stirring the cup, I decided to flip through the logbook. Sometimes we wrote down notes about maintenance issues or damaged goods. That's when I saw the name from the ID badge. My stomach dropped. It belonged to a worker who had died in an accident in the warehouse nearly 5 years ago. A pallet had fallen from one of the top shelves and crushed him instantly. According to the notes, his badge had never been recovered. I stared at the cracked plastic card I'd just picked up. My hands were trembling. And then I heard it again. Footsteps. But this time, they were running. I bolted out of the break room and into the main aisle, shining my flashlight wildly. The sound was unmistakable, pounding footsteps racing between the shelves, circling me. Every time I turned the light in one direction, the sound came from the other. It was like someone was deliberately staying just out of sight. I yelled out, "Who's there?" My voice echoed through the cavernous space. No answer. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I slowly turned in a circle, flashlight beam trembling across the shelves. That's when I saw movement. At the far end of the aisle, a shadow darted across the gap. Tall, fast, gone before I could focus on it. My chest tightened. I wasn't imagining it anymore. I grabbed my things and made a decision. I wasn't staying until sunrise. I didn't care if I got written up. As I hurried toward the exit, I passed the section where I'd first found the badge. Something caught my eye. It was lying on the floor again. I had left it on the supervisor's desk, but there it was, cracked, dirty, exactly where I'd first seen it. I didn't pick it up this time. I just ran. The next morning, I told my supervisor what had happened. He didn't laugh, didn't accuse me of making it up. He just sighed. "You're not the first," he said quietly. "Others have quit over the same thing. Some nights, people hear him. Some nights, they see him. We try not to talk about it. I quit that week. Even now, I think about it sometimes. About those footsteps, circling me in the aisles. About the shadow that darted out of sight. About the badge that wouldn't stay where I left it. I don't know what lingers in that warehouse, but I'm convinced it's him, the man who never walked out the night he died. And I know one thing for sure. That warehouse isn't empty after dark. No matter what anyone says.